Chapter 806. Entering the island in the middle of the night. He did teleport over, Alger thought.
How extravagant.
Alger tensed up before relaxing. However, he did not let his guard down at all. Upon meeting Gehrman Sparrow again, he discovered that there wasn't much of a change to him. However, his every action had the indescribable air of a powerhouse, and the profundity he exuded left him apprehensive.
As expected of the crazy adventurer who can instigate a battle of demigod proportions while escaping unscathed.
The slight bit of smugness of having become a Sequence 5 vanished from Alger. He slowly walked over with lantern in hand. When he saw Gehrman Sparrow, he deliberately probed.
The traces you left behind might not vanish for the next few centuries, or even millennia.
He was trying to confirm if the mountain's collapse had anything to do with Gehrman Sparrow. Klein shot a glance at the modified terrain as he released his grip on his top hat and smiled in a gentlemanly manner.
The one who contributed the most in causing this damage was Sea King.
Man, he actually triggered a demigod battle that could have destroyed Biome, causing Sea King to directly attack. Yet, despite such circumstances, he survived and left with Admiral of Blood. It is completely unimaginable and unbelievable.
Alger began to suspect if Gehrman Sparrow had a Grade 1 sealed artifact on him, an item at the demigod level. He didn't express his shock and surprise, nor did he dare to probe further. Instead, he asked,
"Do you plan on heading to that primitive island now?"
Of course.
Klein answered calmly. It was late at night, a period when Dwayne Dantes was asleep. No one would disturb him, but he had to show himself once it was daytime. Of course, to prevent any unexpected circumstances, Klein had summoned Rhodes to monitor the mirror illusion and provide a response. Klein couldn't help but sigh inwardly.
It is thanks to the Church of Evernight for having ended its dream treatment of Mr. Tycoon. Otherwise, I would definitely have to delay the operation.
Alger observed himself and discovered that he wasn't able to obtain any mystical item in such a short span of time. He then took out an iron-black ring that protruded out like a thorn and wore it on his left thumb. Bearing with the excruciating headache, he nodded slightly.
I hope for a pleasant partnership.
Then, he saw Gehrman Sparrow walk over with a stoic expression, reach out his hand, and grab his shoulder. At that instant, Alger's first reaction was that Gehrman Sparrow was attacking him. He instinctively wanted to turn to the side to dodge his attack, only to recall his previous guess. Amidst his racing thoughts, he withheld his subconscious reaction and allowed the crazy adventurer to place his palm on his left shoulder. Right on the heels of that, he noticed Gehrman Sparrow's left hand turn transparent, as though it was bearing the shadows of the spirit world. Then the blacks before his eyes grew darker, and the crimson moon turned brighter. All kinds of colors seemed to layer upon one another. Countless nearly formless figures receded backwards as Alger tore through the spirit world with Gehrman Sparrow's help. Just as he had such a thought surface in his mind.
Creeping hunger. Teleport. So that is how it is.
He saw his body plummet as the saturated colors around him receded. Everything had returned to normal.
Beach. Reefs. Trees. This is a deserted island.
Alger surveyed the area and was just about to speak when the colors around him saturated as the layered phenomenon happened once again. This time, when he left the spirit world, he was in mid-air with undulating waves beneath him. Although Alger had never worked with Gehrman Sparrow in actual combat before, the experience him immediately created a spiraling wind and allowed them to float. It was a tacit display of teamwork, hence the teleportation triggered successfully once again as Alger's and Gehrman Sparrow's figures rapidly phased away. When the surroundings were restored again, the two had arrived at the periphery of a gigantic island. There was a heavy mist in midair that the crimson moonlight was unable to fully penetrate. This not only failed to disperse the darkness in the forest and mountain, but it also added an eerie charm to it.
We are here,
Alger said as he looked around. Klein wore an indifferent expression, but in fact, he was cautiously observing his surroundings. He found the place extremely quiet. There weren't any birds tweeting, wolves howling, or bugs chirping. It exuded a deathly silence. As though guessing his feelings, Algier raised the lantern and illuminated the shrubs ahead, where there was a natural trail made up of beast-type footprints. He said,
If you come in the day, it will be quite a lively sight. You will even see birds that only exist in myths fly in the forest. But at night, the power that rules this place will change. Many beyonder creatures will hide as they await daybreak.
Mr. Hangman has come here more than once. At the very least, he has the experience of a day and night here.
Klein silently nodded without speaking further. Algier thought for 2 seconds and pointed ahead.
If we follow this trail and enter the dark forest all the way to the end, we will arrive at that ancient ruins of unknown age. On the way, we can hunt the beyonder creatures that we encounter and are able to deal with. If it is killed independently, the corresponding ingredients will belong to the killer. Those we jointly killed will be held in your custody. When we leave this place, we can take turns to choose. We will determine the owner based on our contribution to decide who has the priority to choose, as well as the number of priority choices.
Instead of being in a rush to take action, he first made clear the route and the plan to split the loot. It was to prevent any conflict that would result from the exploration.
To let me have custody of the loot we receive from a joint kill. Mr. Hanged Man is being very sincere.
Klein raised his right hand and pressed down his half-top hat and chuckled.
No problem.
Algier heaved a sigh of relief and continued.
Our main goal is to explore that ancient ruins. The spoils we obtain along the way are supplementary. Once we finish the exploration, it is best we leave immediately, without heading to the other zones or taking other paths. As for anything in the future, it is up to you to decide when and where you would like to explore.
Algier emphasized this matter because he was afraid of Gehrman Sparrow's greed. After all, Beyonders were not perpetual machines. There was bound to be a point when they were exhausted. After a round of explorations, they were bound to be close to their limits. If they were to force themselves to hunt beyonder creatures in other zones, perhaps the identities of hunter and prey would switch. Even if the crazy adventurer was very powerful and unafraid of such danger, to be in a state of drained spirituality would trigger signs of losing control. Klein smiled and said,
Do you think I am not sharing the same thoughts as you? I'm the one worried that you would be the one who is overly greedy, rashly proceeding deeper just to obtain more. I am a polite person.
Polite?
Algier was a little puzzled by Gehrman Sparrow's choice of words. The corners of Klein's mouth curled as his expression turned darker in the darkness.
When visiting someone's place for the first time, overstaying would be impolite.
This fellow's train of thought and logical behavior is completely different from that of a normal person's, as expected of a crazy adventurer.
Algier was first taken aback before he raised the lantern and took a step forward in the dim red shadows.
Let us set off.
Klein allowed his hands to naturally droop down as he walked beside Algier like he was on a hike. The two quickly entered the dark forest that had nearly zero moonlight shining in. They saw that the trees were thick and tall with luxuriant leaves. Even the smallest trees were thicker than the span of a person's arm. And the trait they all had in common was that the bark appeared scaly. They were densely packed together as though they would come to life or squirm at any moment.
It is like a mutated drago tree. A snake-scaled tree?
Klein retracted his gaze and noticed the weeds at his feet that didn't seem problematic. None of them spoke as they maintained a state of abnormal silence. They didn't wish to say anything to eliminate the awkwardness, just because it was too quiet. As they walked, the duo saw the distribution of trees ahead turn sparser, thanks to the lantern's light. Thump! 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 A dull knocking sound echoed through the area. As Algier and Gehrman approached, it became clearer and more obvious. When the duo entered the sparse area, the lantern's light finally revealed hunched or prostrate figures. Amongst these figures were humans, baboons, goats, and tigers. They were either holding rocks or using their claws and teeth to constantly burnish the stacked trees and rocks, as though they were building a palace. Without the obstruction from the luxuriant leaves, the crimson moonlight that penetrated the heavy mist cloaked these figures, dyeing them with a faint blood-red layer.
There are humans?
Klein's eyes focused as he immediately spread his left fingers. Alger slowed down, preparing his vocal cords to be activated at any moment. Suddenly, the figures seemed to sense something as they stopped their actions in unison before uniformly turning around to look at the two outsiders. They either had pale faces, withered skin, or festering bodies. None of them looked alive.
Corpses. A Beyonder creature is driving these corpses to build a palace for it?
Klein cast his gaze past them and saw a dark cave that led deep into the ground. The surroundings were covered in weeds as white feathers stained with yellow oil scattered among them. Feathers. Corpses. These instantly reminded Klein of the products of the numinous episcopate's artificial death project, as well as the infectious aura that made him grow feathers.
This zone's sovereign will not be weak.
He calmly made a judgment. At that moment, Alger, who had carefully observed for a while, hesitated for 2 seconds before suggesting,
I have never seen such a situation before. I am not sure of the level of the Beyonder creature. Why do not we circle around it and choose a target which we have more confidence in?
His instincts told him that something extremely dangerous was hiding in the dark underground cave. Maintaining his persona as Gairman Sparrow, Klein heaved a sigh of relief as he chuckled.
I was waiting for you to say that. Will this be impolite?
Just as he said that, the land quaked as though a creature beneath them was rolling over in its bed. Chapter 807. Mediocre Luck. Sensing the land quake, Alger's heart tightened as he glanced at Gairman Sparrow, using his actions to replace his words. The sound of wind howled beside him, allowing him to run more easily and quickly to the side. The reason why Alger had done so was because he was worried that Gairman Sparrow would suddenly go mad and decide to hunt the terrifying creature inside the dark underground cave. If that were to happen, even if they ultimately clinched a victory, it would have been extremely disadvantageous for the subsequent explorations. As an experienced sailor, he knew that decisive action spurred companions who remained indecisive into subconsciously following his actions. Upon seeing this, Klein heaved a sigh of relief as he gave up the discussion about politeness. He widened his stride and ran behind the hanged man. Following that, he sensed a strong wind blow at his feet, thrusting him forward. This significantly reduced his need to overcome gravity, allowing him to obtain additional mobility that instantly doubled his speed. Amidst the rustling sounds, Klein and Alger ran out of the sparse woods and circled around the flank of the eerie darkness. At this moment, their heartbeats suddenly slowed. It was as though they hadn't been engaging in intense exercise, and were instead in a state of reverie that resulted from the tanning of the afternoon sun. Klein immediately felt his body turn cold as an inexplicable and baffling sense of gloom arose as they tried invading his body. Meanwhile, he saw the light from Alger's lantern be swallowed inch by a gigantic black shadow. A corresponding scene naturally surfaced in his mind. In the depths of the dark underground cave, a thick, humongous serpent snaked out. It had dark green scales with exaggerated eyes that seemed to burn with fire. In between its scales were white feather covered in yellow, oily stains. Along its back was a pair of thick wings that could be spread. While slithering and flying, this giant serpent raised its body high, coiling itself around a thick tree and extending its pitch-black tongue. It stared intently at the two figures that had barged into the surrounding area. Around it, the trees were rapidly withering along with the weeds. Countless corpses burrowed out of the soil as invisible shadows surged to its side. Feathered serpent. It was a feathered serpent. In the southern continent, it was a symbol of holiness. It was the emblem of the descendants of death, the Eggers family. Klein and Alger didn't pause as they held back the coldness of their bodies and their slowing heartbeats. Under the intense winds, they charged into the depths of the dark forest, pulling a distance away from the sparse trees. Badump! 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 The duo's heartbeats gradually returned to normal as the coldness of their bodies were dispersed by the heat generated from the intense exercise. Klein's spiritual intuition told him that the danger had passed. Hence, he slowed down his pace and turned to glance back. He said calmly, while facing the depth of the darkness,
A demigod-level feathered serpent.
Alger similarly slowed down as the blood vessel in his forehead pulsed.
Demigod level.
He paused for 2 seconds and exhaled lightly.
Don't worry about it. The Beyonder creatures here are very territorial. Unless they wish to hunt, they will not enter other zones, especially when it's near the mountain. That feathered serpent wouldn't chase after us.
Klein nodded and said,
The Beyonder creatures here are very strong.
Alger retracted his gaze and replied with a shake of his head.
No, there are also many weak ones. I've been here at night before, but I've only discovered the traces left behind by Beyonder creatures at the demigod level without encountering them. I actually encountered one this time. Such matters are mainly about luck. The chances of this happening again isn't too high.
As a seafarer, being able to calculate was a necessary ability.
Are you looking down on me, the king of yellow and black who wields good luck?
Klein gave a self-deprecating laugh as he said with a deadpan expression,
Absolute judgments often result in the opposite results.
When translated into Earth speak, it was, don't raise death flags. In fact, if it wasn't a feathered serpent at the demigod level, and instead was something at sequence 5, Klein would be happy to bully it. After all, with Azek's copper whistle in hand, the Beyonder creatures in the death domain would lose at least half their combat strength. As for encountering a Beyonder creature at the demigod level, he wasn't too alarmed. This was because the Hanged Man had previously mentioned it, and he had made the corresponding preparations. He had the Fate Siphon Charm, 3 pages of demigod-level Beyonder powers in Leimano's travels, and the ability to travel. Although it wasn't necessarily the case that he could resist a demigod, it was enough to help him create opportunities to escape.
As long as I do not encounter angels.
Klein silently added inwardly. After hearing Gehrman Sparrow, Alger was somewhat puzzled. This was because the crazy adventurer was clearly informing him to be more careful and cautious.
A cold and crazy fellow? That's right. If he's just crazy, he wouldn't have lived to this day.
Alger looked up at the sky as he tried hard to look past the mist and distinguish the blurry stars. After 2 minutes, he retracted his gaze and pointed in a direction.
We'll head in that direction.
Klein had long drawn his iron-black death knell. He allowed the muzzle to naturally point downward as he silently followed alongside Alger. He wore a cold and composed expression that had no signs of anxiety. After traversing the extremely dim forest for some time, Alger suddenly stopped. As he looked to his left, he said in a deep voice,
If we head forward more, there will be an illusory chime tree. I hope to handle it by myself. The second Beyonder creature we encounter will be handled by you. I won't involve myself in the hunt, unless you can't handle it alone.
Alger swallowed the second half of his sentence. He wasn't like the hunters who were often seen at sea, people who often couldn't hold their tongues as they habitually said things that infuriated others.
The main Beyonder ingredient which Miss Justice needs. Mr. Hangman has quite a bit of adventuring experience under his belt. He knows that being frank at times is more useful than concealing matters, and that negotiating is more effective than scheming.
Klein maintained Gehrman Sparrow's persona as he nodded with a hint of gentle manliness amidst his coldness.
Okay? If you can't deal with it, it's best you shout for help. Otherwise, I'll treat it as your persistence.
The style of a crazy adventurer appears to be different from hunters, but in certain aspects they are surprisingly similar. Alger silently drew a breath as he continued forward with his lantern. As they walked, they heard weak chiming sounds, and they immediately felt as though they were home, their bodies and mind at ease. Klein acutely sensed that his wariness was melting away in an irreversible manner. No matter how much he emphasized it to himself, he was unable to tense up. At that instant, he even had the urge to head for the source of the chimes, believing that there was something extremely dear and familiar to him located over there. As they were quite a distance away, the chiming was sporadic. Klein was barely able to hold himself back as he turned to look at Mr. Hanged Man. Alger no longer looked as staid as before. The eyes of his rugged face were slightly red. It was unknown if he had recalled something that caused him to plunge into some emotional state.
I wonder what Mr. Hanged Man looks like when he's crying. It must be quite terrifying.
Klein couldn't help but muse. At this moment, Alger said softly with a hoarse voice,
"Leave it to me."
Just as he said that, he put down the lantern and slightly turned the sinister ring on his left thumb. He made the protruded thorn that looked like it was stained with old bloodstains turn brighter. This was his mystical item, Whip of Mind. Its side effect was to place the wearer in a state of a constant headache, one so bad that the wearer would yearn to slam their head into a wall. However, at that moment, the excruciating headache made Alger maintain his basic lucidity amidst the chimes without being truly hypnotized. At times, a side effect might actually provide benefits to the wearer. As Alger remained poignant, he took out a wooden box from his pocket and snapped it open. Inside, it was a gray rat.
Mr. Hanged Man wishes to use the rat as bait so as to attract the illusory chime tree's attention before taking the opportunity to attack it? Not bad. He made adequate preparations. He already had a detailed plan ahead of time.
As an experienced adventurer, Klein instantly guessed the Hanged Man's thought processes. Alger held up the rat and shook it when his expression suddenly turned odd. The gray rat was no longer moving. It wasn't breathing and was cold. It wasn't able to take on the responsibility of being bait. Back when they encountered the demigod-level feathered serpent, although Alger was in the periphery of the entity's focus and had escaped quickly without being overly affected, the gray rat he carried with him was only an ordinary animal. It didn't have a strong constitution and vitality, so it perished from the effects of the feathered serpent.
It's dead. It's dead. Mr. Hanged Man now understands a principle. Plans often can't keep up with change. His luck is mediocre.
Upon seeing this scene, Klein couldn't help but twitch the corners of his mouth. He wanted to laugh, but he didn't make a sound, afraid that it would destroy his persona. Such situations were rare to the experienced and meticulous Hanged Man. Alger quickly reined in his emotions as he proceeded forward with the dead gray rat. Klein bent down and reached out for the lantern as he unhurriedly followed behind him. The chimes grew clearer as it made them more and more silent, with the urge to run towards it becoming greater. After taking another few steps forward, Klein finally saw that strange tree. Above its brownish-green trunk were thin cracks. Deep inside each crack was a darkness that looked as though different eyes were growing inside them. The branches that extended outwards had chime-like metal-gray objects hanging from them. They were swaying automatically, letting out melodious sounds. And on the branch closest to the trunk, there was a fist-sized, colorless, translucent fruit. Alger stared in that direction as he pressed at his throat before saying to Gehrman Sparrow with a heavy voice,
"It's best you cover your ears and converge your spirituality."
Chapter 808, Awful Singing. Upon hearing the Hanged Man, Klein's heart skipped a beat. He had an ominous premonition as he ignored his persona, put down the lantern, and took out 2 slips of paper. He then crumpled them into a ball and stuffed them into his ears. Seeing Gehrman Sparrow do it without any questions, Alger heaved a sigh of relief. He reflected on how nice it was to work with an experienced fellow. Even though he was an adventurer known to be crazy, he was someone who followed reasonable instructions. He knew what and what not to do. Just as he was about to throw the dead rat, which still retained some of its warmth, at the illusory chime tree to divert its attention, he suddenly saw the shrubs shake as a yellow-skinned, black-striped tiger appeared. Amidst the melodic chimes, the tiger walked towards the strange tree normally, but its eyes were glazed over. It felt indescribably creepy. When Alger saw this, he lowered his arm and abandoned his attempt of throwing the dead rat. Resisting the headache, he calmly watched as the tiger walked closer to the tree due to the growing influence of the melody. It crouched down, raised its right claw, and bared its claws, slicing itself at the neck. Despite the oozing blood, the tiger seemed to have lost all sense of pain. It continued digging in deeper, engorging the wound before it began to skin itself, revealing a naked body covered in mangled flesh and blood. The chimes gradually weakened as the branch suddenly came alive. It extended downwards, stabbing into the tiger's, unprotected body. Alger, who was already prepared, immediately drew his dagger, opened his mouth, and sang hoarsely.
Break, 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 on thy cold grey stones, O sea. Break, 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 at the foot of thy crags, O sea.
His voice had bold overtones, but it was completely out of tune. It was at complete odds with the comprehension of both humans and creatures. It was a jarring boom that had a metallic sound to it. It was filled with the power that left one frustrated and disgusted. Meanwhile, the illusory chime tree's branches trembled as they retracted like they were huddling together. Following that, a melodious chime lessened the terrifying noise to a small extent. At Alger's side, although Klein had used paper balls to stuff his ears and had converged his spirituality, he immediately felt his forehead's blood vessels throb. He instantly had the urge to kill the singer and destroy everything before him. Furthermore, his mind had the feeling of being ripped apart. His muscles and vessels were squirming as a result.
Others charge people money to sing, but Mr. Hangman's singing charges you with death.
Klein lampooned as he resisted the irascibility in his heart.
Break, break, break!
Every word Alger said burst out like waves striking reefs. Bolts of silver lightning descended in turns, as though in euphoric praise. As silver flashes lit up one after another, they smote down at the illusory chime tree's surface, causing it to tremble incessantly. Its branches shook in a numb and random manner, making it difficult for it to produce the melodic, hypnotic music. Alger took this opportunity as he threw the dead rat and thrust the dagger in his hand forward. With a howling wind, invisible blades swooshed over, slicing at the branch at the top and nearest to the illusory chime tree's trunk. Kacha! The colorless, palm-sized, translucent fruit fell as it was swept up by a gust of wind and flew into Alger's palm. The tree bark, which was covered with eye-like cracks, froze as the remaining branches drooped down, having lost their ability to move.
Indeed, as long as you gather the correct intel ahead of time. Beyonder vegetation at the same level is a lot easier to deal with than animals due to its lacking intelligence.
Alger took out a golden container he had prepared, and he put away the illusory chime tree's fruit. Then he turned around to look at Gehrman Sparrow.
Let's continue.
He suddenly stopped speaking as the word forward vanished from his vocal cords. At that instant, he saw Gehrman Sparrow's cold expression looking somewhat warped. The whites around his brown irises were slightly red, as though he would unleash an attack upon him at any moment. Alger felt tense, as he slowly drew a gasp and completed his sentence.
Let's continue forward.
Let's go.
Gehrman Sparrow replied softly. He first circled around the withered, illusory chime tree and walked deep into the dark forest. He didn't get any bark, branches, or materials that were rich in spirituality, because they were bound to encounter many Beyonder creatures later. Furthermore, he didn't have any so-called storage artifacts. Naturally, he left whatever space he had for worthwhile spoils. Besides, having too many things on him would only weigh him down and prevent him from fully displaying the agility of a clown.
Unfortunately, those are materials without any vitality or blood, making it impossible to enter Grozel's travels. I can let my marionette bring them in, but that will be very troublesome and detrimental to the subsequent exploration.
As Klein sighed, he calmed his mind, extricating himself from the remnant effects of the hanged man's singing. This was the most jarring and terrible singing that he had heard in both his lives. If the hanged man continued for another 1 or 2 minutes, he couldn't guarantee that he could stop himself from beating him up.
Using just paper balls to stuff my ears and converging my spirituality can only weaken the effects. There's no way to really block it out. Even a deaf person can hear it. This includes an exchange at the spirituality level. This is probably the most indefensible attack from an ocean songster. Furthermore, there's no way of dodging it once it happens. There's only lightning strike which can be dodged ahead of time. This is a rather powerful sequence 5 as well. However, why does Mr. Hanged Man's singing feel completely different from Elven songster Ciatis?
As Klein summarized and analyzed his experience, he was somewhat puzzled. At this moment, the lantern-holding Alger, who was walking beside him, couldn't help but consider a question.
Even German Sparrow can't stand my singing. How should I act as an ocean songster?
In that silent environment, the two quickly proceeded forward amidst thick trees that appeared to be covered in snakeskin as they approached the ancient ruins. With a seafarer beside him, Klein saved himself the trouble of using dowsing rod seeking. He focused on watching out for any sudden attacks. The dark and silent environment resembled a horror story. As the two proceeded forward for an unknown amount of time, they discovered that the trees were beginning to systematically become sparse. Afur. This was completely different from the situation back when they met the demigod-level feathered serpent. The trees there had abruptly become sparse, while what they were encountering now was a progressive change. It made them have the misconception that they were about to leave the dark forest.
After passing through this zone, we will arrive at the periphery of the ancient ruins.
Alger broke the silence. Kala here? He paused and then added seemingly casually,
Based on my experience, it becomes more dangerous as we approach it. The signs of a demigod creature I found last time was around here. However, oddly, the periphery of the ancient ruins doesn't have any signs of beyonder creatures. However, I have no idea about deep inside it.
This is probably because there's an even more terrifying existence inside the ancient ruins. That zone is its territory, so other creatures do not dare to approach.
Klein mumbled inwardly. He had a sense for the danger level of this expedition. He had previously performed the corresponding divination above the gray fog, and the revelation he received was that it had its ups and downs, as well as its problems. However, leaving safely wasn't much of a problem. After the hanged man said that, Klein chuckled.
You likely know what my guess is.
He didn't say anything further as he entered the zone with sparse vegetation. Alger silently walked beside him, increasingly convinced about his judgment of German Sparrow. He was calm and crazy. After proceeding dozens of meters forward, they suddenly saw a pair of ghostly blue eyes situated at where the lantern's glow could reach. It was a black baboon crouched on a branch. Its fur was naturally curled, and its head grew black crystals. These crystals grew upwards in a random manner, forming a strange crown. Upon seeing the black baboon, Klein and Alger simultaneously had the urge to bow their heads to not look directly at it. They felt as though it was the ruler of the nearby region, their sovereign.
Sovereign.
Alger relied on the excruciating headache which the whip of mind brought him in order to escape its influence, as he hurriedly took a step to the left in an attempt to avoid any direct clashes. He left the unknown beyonder creature to German Sparrow. They had agreed to it prior. However, despite walking to the left, he ended up walking forward. His legs also hobbled as though he suddenly needed crutches. Subconsciously, Alger drew his dagger, causing sharp wind blades to swish towards the curly-haired baboon. At that moment, the baboon grinned. The wind blades suddenly changed direction in midair, moving in every direction at random to perfectly avoid hitting the target. Upon seeing this scene, Klein gave up his plans on approaching through ordinary methods. His left glove instantly turned transparent as he turned invisible. Alger stopped his actions that resulted from his stress when he saw German Sparrow in his top hat appear behind the black curly-haired baboon. The distance between them was less than 5 meters. Right on the heels of that, the black, curly-haired baboon's body abruptly stiffened as though it lost control of most of its body. It even tried hard to raise its palm. trying hard to dig at its eyes in an attempt to distort something. And at this moment, Gehrman Sparrow had already made use of this delay to raise the iron-black revolver in his right hand, aiming the dark barrel at its head. Then, without any emotion, the crazy adventurer pulled the trigger. Chapter 809. The Danger Amidst the Darkness. Bang! The loud gunshot reverberated in the sparse and open region as they extended outwards. If it was an ordinary island with an ordinary forest at night, it would have alarmed the birds and beasts, sending them scattering away. But here, everything remained quiet, so quiet that it didn't seem like any living creatures existed. As for that black, curly-haired baboon, its head had burst open, splattering blood and brain matter everywhere, like it was raining. The black crystal at its head shattered as well, with not a single piece remaining intact. Klein bent his arm and slowly retracted Death Knell, which was still spewing out smoke. He watched as the mutated curly-haired baboon's stocky body, one more that was muscular than a human's, collapsed to the ground. By approaching with traveling, forcefully controlling with Wraith, and seizing the opportunity to deal a lethal strike with Death Knell, it was an instant kill. Klein wasn't doing this to flaunt his strength, but via his observations, he believed that the mutated curly-haired baboon had unique powers. If he didn't quickly finish it off, while it didn't understand anything about him, there was a very high chance that the situation would be reversed, making the battle rather tricky. Besides, on such a dangerous, primitive island, it was imperative he avoided situations from escalating, for no one knew what things could be lured by an intense battle. Therefore, after Klein possessed the mutated curly-haired baboon with a Wraith, he gave up on the more reliable and more unnoticeable method of controlling spirit body threads because it took longer. Instead, he chose to cock the gun and use Death Knell to finish it off while it was stiff and slow as a result of the Wraith's influence. The effects were identical to his expectations. The possible accidents that could happen midway were as he imagined. With the help of distortion and disorder, the mutated curly-haired baboon did possess the ability to extricate itself from the unfavorable situation of the Wraith's possession, and it would allow the bullet's trajectory to violate the laws of physics and avoid its body. Unfortunately, its efforts had come to an abrupt stop before it could change any effects. Klein had seized that brief moment of sluggishness to decisively deliver the lethal strike. If he had switched to controlling spirit-body threads, the outcome might have been very different.
It's worth it to suffer a weakness for this. Furthermore, there's a higher chance of me being needed to use Death Knell later. Compared to realizing what I'm afraid of in a more dangerous environment, it's better to know the problem ahead of time and avoid similar situations. That's the better option.
Klein allowed his revolver to point downward as he walked to the side of the mutated curly-haired baboon. At this moment, under the Wraith's control, the Beyonder characteristic of the Beyonder creature rapidly appeared. Alger held up the lantern as he watched this scene from a distance away. It took him nearly 1 minute to snap back to his senses. Frozen in his mind was ultimately the scene of the flare from Gehrman Sparrow's muzzle and the bursting head of the curly-haired baboon. The disorder they encountered in the beginning had made him understand that the Beyonder creature they had encountered was at a sequence higher than that of the illusory chime tree. It was a relatively difficult creature to deal with, one that required sufficient caution during combat. Furthermore, there wasn't any guarantee of victory. Yet, Gehrman Sparrow had finished the battle in 3 seconds. The speed at which it happened was as though he was engaging in target practice. Being a Sequence 5 Beyonder as well, the difference was unbelievable.
Combining a short-distance teleportation ability and a strange power that can control an enemy for a certain amount of time, along with that astoundingly potent revolver, the effects are unimaginable, terrifying. If I were to encounter it for the first time, I would definitely be killed instantly. And even if I'm prepared, it wouldn't be easy to resist it. The best solution is to use my singing to affect my surroundings indiscriminately. It will prevent Gehrman Sparrow from successfully completing a teleport, as expected of a crazy adventurer with a bounty of 50,000 pounds. Even without Mr. Fool's help, just him alone isn't weaker than Admiral Hell. It's possible that he's even stronger.
While sighing poignantly, Algier reined in his thoughts as he considered how he could deal with the situation if he were in the curly-haired baboon's shoes. Compared to the descriptions from others and his own guesses, witnessing it himself was more convincing and shocking. Inside the corpse of the curly-haired baboon where the shattered black crystal was, a faint blob of light quickly appeared and converged together, turning into a translucent, pitch-black fist that was tightly clenched. Indifferently to their thoughts, the fist produced a feeling of strength and sinisterness. The palm's lines, luster, and fingernails seemed to follow ordinary principles, but they were filled with an abnormal charm. It seemed to hide large amounts of madness and disorder.
Sequence 5, Mentor of Disorder from the Black Emperor Pathway. I wonder what weakness I received. I hope it's not too odd. I can use Death Knell as much as I want in the next 6 hours.
As Klein muttered, he bent down to pick up the Beyonder characteristic and stored it in a prepared metal container. In fact, he could attempt to graze the curly-haired baboon and see if he could obtain the corresponding Beyonder powers of a Mentor of Disorder so as to swap away his gloves barren of corruption. But ultimately he gave up on that idea since he wasn't sure what the Beyonder creature had done that made it deserve such torture. His encounter had been an encounter on a battlefield. Ensuring his enemy's death was nothing out of the ordinary, but grazing was an extremely excruciating pain that left a soul yearning for liberation. Klein had his own principles and stubbornness. He didn't easily violate them, and he often cautiously chose his targets. Of course, to him, creatures of lower intelligence were not the same as humans. Even if he attempted to graze it, it wasn't crossing the line. However, many of his past experiences told him that persisting to keep to his principles and not relax the requirements for himself was not only a moral question, but was something to prevent himself from losing himself. He couldn't keep pushing the envelope just because he thought it was nothing. As the trivialities accumulated, it would eventually result in a terrible mistake.
In this crazy and chaotic, mysterious world, actions aren't for others to see, but for myself. A person can fool humans and even deities, but they can't fool themselves. I wonder if high-sequence Beyonders from the Spectator Pathway can fool themselves.
As Klein's thoughts raced, he took out Grozel's travels that he hid near his chest, intending to smear the curly-haired baboon's blood over its cover. At that moment, his heart tensed up as the hair along his neck stood up. This was an intense premonition of danger, and in this premonition, no scene had surfaced in Klein's mind.
Not good.
Klein instantly found his heart wrapped in layers of shadows, as everything before his eyes seemed to be covered in a layer of dark glass. Without the luxury of time to consider what was happening, the glove on his left palm turned transparent once again. His figure turned invisible before he appeared beside Algier, reaching out to grab his shoulder. Havis caw. At that instant, Algier also sensed the abnormality. His heart contracted and expanded like the source of a storm, as his blood surged through his veins and arteries like a tidal wave. Meanwhile, he saw Gehrman Sparrow's right hand, which was grabbing his shoulder. From the fingernails, it was turning gray and turning dull, bit by bit, just like any stone that could be found anywhere in the dark forest. And his feet, knees, and muscles were turning stiff as though they no longer belonged to him. The two figures quickly turned transparent as they vanished from their location and entered a saturated and clearly overlapped spirit world as they quickly traversed it in the direction of the ancient ruins. Suddenly, the red, green, black, and other stacked colors before Klein's eyes uniformly darkened as they produced fine patterns that resembled raven black hair. Raven black hair! A chill rose up from their souls as Klein didn't hesitate to leave the spirit world with the hanged man and return to the real world, where they landed in an area mixed with rubble and weed. Not far away was a mostly collapsed building. Through the corner of his eye, the hanged man had already turned grayish-white from the waist down, as though he had turned into a stone sculpture. Pah! Klein snapped his fingers, igniting the grass tens of meters away in preparation to leap over. At that moment, he suddenly felt his heart palpitate as his body began to tremble involuntarily. The appearance of the soaring flames was terrifying to him. The weakness Death Knell gave him this time: fear of fire. Seeing the dark glass thicken before his eyes, Klein felt a howling wind sweep him up from below before he could overcome the fear, causing him and Algier to fly up, passing through the invisible border and entering the vicinity of the ancient ruins. Bang! The duo fell to the ground simultaneously, producing the sound of crashing rocks. The thick shadow over their hearts vanished as the danger that hid in the darkness receded like the tide. Phew! Klein heaved a sigh of relief as he saw the grayish-white color that had spread to his elbow turn faint and recede. He felt his physical condition was rapidly recovering after he left that zone. His back was covered in perspiration that soaked his shirt. And what left him most horrified was that he didn't know what monster had attacked him or what powers were used.
Did Death Knell's gunshot alarm some monster in the vicinity? Or is it the existence that rules over this forest at night? Thankfully, it doesn't dare to enter the vicinity of the ancient ruins. This isn't necessarily good. This means that deep in the ancient ruins is something that makes it fearful. I should be prepared to retreat at any moment.
Klein stretched his hands and slowly stood up. At this moment, Algier escaped from that grayish-white lair as he turned his head to glance over.
That zone was petrifying us.
That zone. Petrification. Klein nodded in thought as he walked towards the mostly collapsed building that was strewn with weeds and covered in vines. He then replied in a deep tone,
The problem now lies ahead.
Algier didn't speak further as he sped up his pace, steadily walking by his side. After approaching, Klein looked at the building. His gaze swept the spires and stone columns, as well as the damaged walls that remained standing. He stopped and asked seemingly casually,
What kind of building do you think this ruin was in the past?
Algier remained silent for a few seconds before saying,
Cathedral. A cathedral.
Chapter 810. Whose Cathedral?
A cathedral. We came to the same judgment.
Klein looked at the ruin ahead of him as he silently muttered to himself. At that moment, the tiny amount of crimson moonlight that penetrated the mist had scattered onto the collapsed building. Compared to before, it was a lot richer in color, almost approaching the color of blood. Klein maintained Sparrow's trademark cold attitude as he said in an unperturbed manner,
Where did you previously explore?
As he spoke, Klein glanced at the lantern in the hanged man's hand, which remained unshattered despite all the ordeals. He subconsciously tensed up his muscles and skin when he saw the glow from the flame. Although the flame was ultimately contained by thick glass and metal frame, it still left him a little afraid. Algier didn't notice the minute changes in Sparrow as he raised his dagger-wielding right hand and pointed at the grandest building amidst the ruin.
There.
All that was left of the building was its main structure. It was impossible to know what it originally looked like. The only things that could only be determined were that it had thick walls with narrow windows, and the building's scale and its magnificence. Furthermore, it once had a spire and clock tower. It had a Spartan facade and an ancient architecture.
This is an architectural style from the early 4th epoch. There are records of these in the Church of Storms' canon. It's said that, in that period, the various churches used such styles to build their cathedrals in a widespread fashion. Its greatest trait is the temple found above and the catacombs found below. Life and death were both unified here. However, I cannot confirm that the ancient cathedral's interior is as I described, as I've never ventured deep into it.
Algier had a deep impression on the ruin. Over the years, he had flipped through many books and had acquired quite a bit of the background.
This might be an architectural style left behind from the 3rd epoch.
Klein made a guess as he walked straight to the opening of the ancient cathedral ruin's abnormally huge door. By keeping the lantern behind him, enjoying only the light emitted from it, he didn't need to suffer from his fear of fire. The duo quickly moved up the grayish-white stairs that were ridiculously high, and they arrived at the door's opening. Inside, they saw remnants of stone columns and arches that extended upwards towards the center. Furious? Klein wasn't in a rush to enter. He reached his left hand into his pocket and took out a gold coin as he allowed it to weave between his finger while seemingly muttering something. Suddenly, he flipped the gold coin and opened his palm to await its descent while saying to the hanged man,
How did you determine that deep in this cathedral is something of value that is not less than that of the cards of blasphemy?
After he said that, he looked at the gold coin that had fallen into his palm before putting it away. Alger pointed inside and said,
I've said before that my strength was inferior to Colango's, and I didn't go as deep as he did. I had no idea what he saw, other than the judgment that there was something extremely precious and important inside from his remarks. Furthermore, it was something that only a true Sequence 5 could obtain. However, the murals near the entrance and the marks on the ground might be able to explain something.
Klein nodded and walked through the dark door's opening that the crimson moonlight was unable to illuminate. The black trench coat he wore fluttered gently behind him as Alger held up a lantern and clenched his dagger while following behind. Passing through the opening, Klein used the crimson moonlight that shone in from the opening at the dome to see the hall of considerable depth up ahead. A few of the ancient stone columns supporting it had already snapped. At the end wasn't an altar, nor were there any staircases that led upwards. It was completely dark and difficult to tell the details. It appeared as though it led underground.
It isn't a temple above and a catacomb beneath. The temple is underground in the catacombs? It's impossible to determine that. We'll know only by venturing down.
Klein subconsciously glanced around and discovered side doors along the two sides, but the regions they led to had already completely collapsed, with no usable path.
The murals near the entrance and the marks on the ground.
He recalled what the hanged man had just said, and he took 2 diagonal steps before releasing the invisible Wraith Senor. With his night vision, he began observing the remaining murals. The mural's background was of a towering and magnificent mountain. At its peak was a gigantic cross that was covered in a lustrous glow. In front of the cross were grand and abnormal figures that were clustered around. They were angels with 2 wings, 4 wings, or 6 wings.
This.
Klein did a cursory glance and felt a strong sense of familiarity.
He had seen a similar mural before, back in Blasphemon's mausoleum.
When he focused again, Klein quickly noticed the difference. There weren't the 2 infants that represented Amen and Adam, nor were there any 12-winged angels. The grand figure in front of the cross held its arms to its chest as it held an ancient Spartan slate. Zenen. The slate was drawn in an extremely indistinct manner. Yet it felt both ancient and young, holy and sinister. It was in extreme contradiction.
Slate.
Klein's pupils dilated slightly as a specific term flashed in his mind.
Blasphemy slate. This is likely that ancient Placian sun god, the Lord that created everything which the City of Silver worships. Indeed, the blasphemy slate is closely related to him. I wonder if this is the first blasphemy slate or the second.
Klein roughly guessed at the cathedral's worshipped entity, and he also began to believe that the depths of the ruin hid items that were very valuable and important. He withdrew Senor's gaze and allowed the marionette to turn to face the ground. Apart from the slates being covered in cracks and some odd marks remaining, they were dark red in color, smaller than a human's forehead. They overlapped with one another at times, as they extended all the way to the ends of the hall. At that instant, a scene naturally appeared in Klein's mind. Devout believers were prostrated on the ground as they proceeded forward, slamming their foreheads heavily onto the ground after covering a certain distance, leaving blood oozing out. Noticing Gehrman Sparrow look around without any scrutiny, Alger probed.
The ancient sun god?
At that moment, he felt the baffling sensation of a cold wind blowing from Gehrman Sparrow's side. He suspected that hidden around them were shadows or wraiths. Recalling the strange restraints the mutated curly-haired baboon was under, Alger made a vague theory that he didn't voice out. Upon hearing the hanged man's question, Klein had wanted to chuckle and reply, "You can also call him the Lord that created everything, the omnipotent and omniscient God." But he felt that such a tone and choice of words was closer to that of the fool and not Gehrman Sparrow. Hence, he held himself back and nodded slightly.
It's not hard to tell.
Alger silently heaved a sigh of relief as he held a sense of anticipation for the item buried deep underneath the cathedral. The two simultaneously decided to walk towards the end of the hall. When they approached it, Klein finally saw the staircase that led downwards.
An underground area?
He asked succinctly. Alger shook his head.
I can't be sure. I've never gone down. Although Kulangos had attempted to venture in, he returned in less than 10 minutes, with his aura becoming relatively weak.
Klein nodded thoughtfully and said in passing,
You seem to be very familiar with him.
If it were said by anyone else, Alger would have pretended to have not heard it or answered directly. But deep in his heart, the world-German sparrow was Mr. Fool's blessed. His question could possibly represent the intentions of that existence, so he needed to view them seriously. After deliberating for a few seconds, Alger said in a deep voice,
We were fellow townsmen, and we were servants at the same cathedral. The priest there was an easily irritated person who enjoyed punishing the servants. Kulangos couldn't bear it and escaped secretly to become a pirate.
So there was such a past. Mr. Hanged Man is also a man with a story.
Klein didn't probe deeper as he headed down the staircase in the extremely silent cathedral ruins. Although his footsteps were extremely light, they still sounded obvious in such an environment as they echoed. Soon the two of them came to the end of the staircase and saw the opening of an arched door. On both sides of the opening were two shadows that stood there silently in an immutable fashion. Klein and Alger halted at the same time as they looked at the two shadows, only to discover that they were two stone statues. They were both men, with their surface being grayish-white. One of them wore full-body armor that resembled a barrel, and the other wore a jacket that looked more contemporary. Their expressions were writhing in pain as their eyes protruded as though they were glaring at something. Upon seeing this scene, Klein realized something as he recalled the encounter outside. He and Alger had also shown signs of petrification, and it was thankful that they extricated themselves of the effects, or they might have really become statues.
Don't tell me they're humans who met with the same situation. If we had been petrified, would we be moved down here standing guard at this door opening for centuries or even millennia? The source of that petrifying power isn't afraid of these ruins?
Klein felt explicable horror as his scalp tingled. He controlled his emotions and turned his head to look at the hanged man. He discovered that the pupils of the boorish man at sea had similarly dilated and was clutching the dagger tightly.
Mr. Hanged Man has come to the same conclusion without me needing to speak further.
Klein pointed at the door opening and said,
There might be even more stone statues inside.
Alger nodded as he said worriedly and jokingly,
Let's hope we don't see ourselves.
If we're convinced that we have escaped the effects of petrification, only to see our statues in this underground area, that would be quite the horror story.
Klein thought for 2 seconds and said to the hanged man,
Do you have night vision?
His true meaning was that the light of the lantern was especially eye-catching in the dark catacombs, and that it might easily cause unwanted developments. Therefore, it was best to extinguish the flame if he had night vision, and he believed that Mr. Hanged Man was able to read in between the lines. Alger replied frankly,
Yes.
As a beyonder of the sailor pathway who could dive, it was a given that he had night vision. Klein glanced at him without a word, but his meaning was obvious.
Then why are you still using a lantern?
Alger seriously replied,
Firstly, it's to misdirect the enemy into instinctively believing that I don't have night vision because of my use of a lantern. When they destroy my lantern and try hard to create a dark environment, I'll give them a pleasant surprise. Secondly, it's to avoid situations similar to the City of Silver. There might be extreme danger lurking within complete darkness.
How sinister.
Klein was momentarily at a loss for words.
Makes sense.
Klein didn't insist that Alger extinguish the lantern as he first stepped past the 2 stone statues. Under their pain-frozen gazes, he stepped into the entrance that led underground. He didn't know what the petrified statues represented, nor did he know if they were completely dead. Klein didn't attempt to shatter them to obtain their beyonder characteristics and mystical items.